So why do we focus on strength? Why am I the Strength Jedi, and why do we focus on strength training as your main focus? Well, it's not just because you're weak necessarily. I don't like spreading that message. I like spreading the message that we're actually relatively strong. But the strength training aspect, basically for me, there was an epiphany moment for me in my career where I looked at the concept that I'm about to show you, and it really changed my mindset on a lot of things. So let's say we do a VO2 max test for aerobic power, and we do that on a 20-year-old, and then we also do that on an 80-year-old. And of course, VO2 max will decline, and so right away you're thinking, oh, geez, I want to try and increase my VO2 max because that's something that declines with age. If we look at the ADLs that are associated with different levels of the aerobic system, dressing, domestic work, walking on the level, at the level that is, or at the speed that is congruent with community ambulation, getting across the street before the light changes, that sort of thing, walking staircase, all of these things seem to be very aerobically dominant when we're relatively young. But as we start getting older, you see that they can get progressively more and more difficult from a relative perspective. So again, looking at this, you think, geez, I better get my VO2 max up because I really want to improve some of these things in my older patients, or my patients that are aging or middle age, and from a prevention perspective. The problem is VO2 max isn't very trainable. It's on a good training program, you might get 20 to 25% of an increase in VO2 max. Endurance is a different scenario, but if we're just talking about aerobic power, that this holds true. Of course, in the presence of chronic disease or any particular issues that happen, that this will actually decline faster, and then these ADLs become much more difficult. So the study that was the epiphany moment was this Koska study from 2008, basically showing that both the relative and the absolute decreases in aerobic and anaerobic power over time. We see that the anaerobic power decreases faster, at a faster rate than the aerobic system. And the thing about the anaerobic power is that it is also much more trainable. So again, in contrast to the 20-25% of the aerobic power, anaerobic power you can increase over the course of a good quality training program. You might increase 50 up to 200%, depending on the measure that you're using. So let's have a look at the anaerobic system. So this is the previous graph just compressed, and what I've done is I've overlaid the concept of what Koska found, is that this relative and absolute decrease in the anaerobic system. And then we start looking at some of these activities that were aerobic and when you were younger, become much more anaerobic with age. And of course, that's a construct that happens with a decrease in the aerobic system. But it means that we're dependent much more on the anaerobic system. And then you start looking at functional performance, like a sit-to-stand peak power, things like that are very much anaerobically dominated. Of course, again, in the anaerobic system, we do see that with chronic disease, this will decrease, but again is much more trainable than the aerobic system with chronic disease. Now, where does strength come into this? Well, the research looking at the anaerobic system and all of this functional performance that sits in the anaerobic domain is not limited by the energy system, but it's limited by muscle strength and power. So it's more the neuromuscular system, which is in contrast to the lower levels of the aerobic system, which is aerobic energy provided by the cardiovascular system. So the neuromuscular system definitely dominates when we look at this high intensity strength and power, which is really where the focus then comes for me, is looking at developing strength and power to access all the this functional reserve that we have in the anaerobic system.